All right. These are kind of the five different things that people use to support the innateness theory and support the idea of universal grammar, the universality of language. So basically, all human communities have languages. There are very few limited cases where people don't acquire language, and those are kind of those tragic. Someone's lost for a long time and on their own a long time. They just don't have any human communication or cases of abuse, unfortunately. But in general, 99.99999% of people acquire language. Even obviously there are some cognitive and developmental disabilities that might slow that down or impede that, but even with a lot of cognitive issues, you're still you have your Down syndrome, you have your autism spectrum. A lot of time you have nonverbal on the autism spectrum, but a lot of time individuals on that spectrum, on the and on the Down syndrome sort of spectrum, they will still acquire some form of language, the language that they are exposed to. Like I said, there are cases where those are exceptions, but generally when there are no, I guess you could say, issues, what we consider medical issues or cognitive issues, we all tend to acquire at least one native language, whatever we're kind of exposed to as children. It's not necessarily the language that our parents speak, because people are adopted, and you might adopt someone from another country, bring them over to another country, and they speak that language. The poverty of the stimulus: children learn language with relatively little direct input. So we don't sit down. It's basically saying we don't sit down and give grammar lessons to our kids. I get the example I gave is my kids grew up are growing up speaking Spanish and English, and I spent semesters and years differentiating between preterite and imperfect and subjunctive, and doing exercises and doing tests to acquire that as a second language. My kids, they're 6 years old, they're sitting there, you're just throwing out preterite and imperfect like it's nothing. So half of me is very proud, the other half is very envious, because I put in so much time and they just like existed basically, and when Spanish was flowing around them. And so it's saying that without that direct input, it's saying the basis of that is saying that in order to acquire language, you need more direct input, which is I'm not 100% in agreement with, because we don't sit there and give them grammar lessons, but they're constantly absorbing everything, whether directly or indirectly, not just from their parents and their siblings. Go outside, you hear stuff, you see stuff, people conversing, and they pick a lot of stuff up. And like for example, my daughter, I guess she's been lately really getting into I guess some Minecraft in some of her free time, and this thing called Roblox. And then she was playing a game on it. She's like, oh no, I'm winning. Oh no, looks like the other guy, he's AFK, Dad, he's AFK. I'm like, I didn't learn that till like 2 years ago from the Big Bang Theory, away from keyboard. So they just hear that stuff or read that stuff, and it kind of comes in. Creole languages. So a Creole language is a language like Creole languages that are spoken. You have Haitian Creole. You got Creole in Trinidad and Tobago. You got Creole in there's St. Thomas, an island in the Caribbean as well. And it's when you get two languages. A lot of times it's a colonizing language and a native language of the area. And in order to communicate, you strip everything down to the most basic. So it's like kind of you Tarzan, me Jane. We have some sayings in English that are left over from pidgin languages, which is what they're called when they get stripped down. But in the first generation, pidgin languages between Native American and United States or Great Britain colonizing North America, like long time no see, for example, instead of saying, oh, I haven't seen you in a while. That's where it comes from. And so it'll strip it down to the most basic, kind of human, to be able to communicate on the most basic thing. A lot of times for trade just to coexist. But sometimes, because it is unfortunately a product of colonization, the children born into this will learn the pidgin language as their native language, except they put all of those complex elements back into it. And we're going to see a video in just a couple minutes on that. And so it actually becomes a language. So where subjunctive and conjugations are gone, and prepositions might be gone, and conjunctions might be gone, they come back in some form in the second generation. And that's when a pidgin turns into Creole. So if you talk about Haitian Creole, you talk about, that, the Creole spoken in Trinidad and Tobago, and there's Creole spoken in Philippines that have Spanish in them, because Philippines was a colony for 300 years, you will see all of these complex elements come back in. And they're saying, okay, we're wired. There's some sort of grammaticality there. Our languages need, native languages want all those complex elements. That's kind of what this hypothesis was throwing in. Stages of L1 acquisition, basically, we, in every language, it seems like children acquire language at kind of the same steps. They babble, and certain sounds they start producing, then more complex sounds, putting, single words, then maybe 2-syllable words or whatever, however you define a syllable in that language, and so on and so on. And then the critical period hypothesis, it basically says, you have until about puberty to acquire a language natively. And this is, seen in all languages. So that's what they mean by universality of language. And so this was, this is just a brief overview of, this whole theory. Chomsky didn't develop this theory for translation, but it's been applied to machine translation, trying to take machine translation, like we said, machine translation and information theory, which is, the probability statistics, and all that, to create like an algorithm or a program that can look at all of these elements, take, if there's universal grammar, and then in theory, okay, I can put any language in if I got the right algorithm and spit any language out. That's kind of the theory sort of behind it. A lot easier said than done. And we're going to, when it said the universality of language, we're going to look at this. So this is an example of the birth of a sign language in Nicaragua, showing how they are alingual, but once they get to, they were able, these group of kids were able to get together, they'd actually developed their own language. And so this is kind of that hardwired for language sort of concept. Can everyone?
Nicaragua, Central America.
And that is Liam Neeson, by the way.
Managua. Here, as in other places of the world, there are those who hardly have any language at all. Maria Noname.
This is kind of showing that this is one of those exceptions to the language. She's deaf. She was not exposed to sign language. And so she never acquired a language natively. She can communicate, but never really acquired a native language.
Mary No Name. Deaf since birth, she has been isolated all her life, both from the people who could help her and from others with her disability. Her friend, linguist Judy Kegel, understands the depth of her isolation. The two can communicate just a little, using simple and primitive gestures.
The first time I met her, she was missing the ability to tell me who she was. She was missing the ability to tell me how old she was. She doesn't know her name. In order to tell me who she was, she had to take me home and show me the papers and pictures of her family. We had to share a context. She can tell me things. I can show you a bit. She can tell me what happened to her father. I asked her about her father dying, and she said 3, okay? What 3 meant was he was shot 3 times. I know this from working with the other deaf signer, that she said he was shot in 3 places. And that's how her father died, right? Yeah. Right. And, but 3 is just not enough to give me access to the information that I would have needed had I not had prior knowledge about that. Papa. Okay. What she's saying is, I had a daughter that went away and got married, and that was it. She never came back. I had a son that went away, and I never heard from him again. That's it. I'm alone. That's my life. She was language ready. The problem was she didn't get access to language within that critical period, and that critical window for learning language in the way that we learned it is closed.
This window for language remains open until we reach age 7. Then it slowly closes as we advance towards puberty. Before the 1980s, many deaf Nicaraguans were like Mary No Name. They never encountered the window for language because they never encountered others with their disability. But in 1980, after the Nicaraguan Revolution, the new government tried to enhance deaf people's lives. It brought deaf village children into Managua to end their isolation. Here, educators tried to teach them an existing sign language. The effort failed. The children showed little interest in learning a language forced upon them. Instead, they began communicating with each other in their own.
The direct input sort of thing. So they tried to give them direct input and they actually rejected it. It seems like, that wasn't the natural way to acquire a language.
Way. Judy Cagle was summoned from the United States to sort out the problem.
I came down thinking wherever there were deaf people, there was a sign language, and that obviously there would be a full-blown sign language in full swing here in Nicaragua. And I said, well, I can learn a bit of their sign language if that's what you want, and work with you on learning it. They said, no, they don't have a sign language. They have mimicas. They have mime gestures. And they pointed to a group of kids and said, we want to know what they're talking about.
It turned out they were talking about a lot more than anyone dreamed possible. Cagle had arrived in Nicaragua shortly after the birth of a new language.
Language needs company. Language needs a community. Language needs some sort of a trigger. And I think that trigger is, it's not so much that it needs a community in the sense that there have to be lots of people, but part of being a community is wanting to share information with each other.
Might this moment resemble what happened around 50,000 years ago? The turning point that led to the explosion of human creativity? Language does not need a voice. It is our legacy, an inevitability of being human. Today, we still don't know exactly when language evolved, when it opened the door to our phenomenal success as a species.
This is a verb reduplicated.
But language.
You see, she's going to talk about all these different elements of the language. These are complex, and the kids just develop. These are complex, rule-based elements of the language. So you're talking about reduplication. You have reduplication in a lot of languages. We saw that in one of the early videos we watched on, comparing the differences between English and other languages, for example. And you see, it's got all sorts of grammatical structure. And so there's this kind of, like I said, that's what it's said to support the universality of language, universal grammar that was originally used, like I said, they tried to implement it into translation, saying if there's a universal grammar, then in theory, we can plug it in if we get the right calculations, and we can get any language to come out.
Language, every language, depends on strict rules, all of them familiar.
That's a role shift to man looking at the bird, then back to the man falling off the mountain, dreaming that he's going to fly like a bird.
While many species can communicate, even vocalize, only human languages are driven by complex rules. Every one of our world's 6,300 languages has them. We call them syntax. In her isolation, Mary No Name never encountered syntax, but it is commonplace in the children's language.
Syntax isn't the set of rules that you learned in your third grade grammar that you had to memorize so you spoke English the way you're supposed to. Syntax is, or language, the constraints on language are something that all human beings share. They're the constraints that are imparted to us by the fact that we share a single human brain. They are not just the constraints, but the ability to hierarchically organize information that allows us to construct sentences, novel sentences that have never been said before, that allows us to tell a story, that allows us to prophecy, that allows us to lie.
So that's one of the big things also with machine translation. one of its big limitations is you cannot create the spontaneity that we can as human beings. We can just make up a sentence that has never been said before. I could say, I don't know, the purple pixie dragon drank the Kool-Aid next to the teddy bear on, I don't know, Quaker Avenue or whatever. Makes grammatical sense, absolute, rubbish and, gibberish, but it makes grammatical sense. And that's the ability we have as humans. That's the one of the huge differences that limits machine translation is machine translation we've talked about, we'll continue to talk about, needs constant input of already translated text or already already existing language. But to create spontaneity, the spontaneous ability to develop language and to use language to fit our needs, the machine translation obviously doesn't have that. It can have all the rules you want, but we can take those rules and modify them, make them evolve or whatever, and create new language. And it's always, this machine translation thing is always playing catch up. That's why the whole Captain Picard, universal translation Star Trek thing is very unrealistic. And I don't even know if it is even remotely possible with as much any technology we might get in the future. So yeah, so this is basically showing the universality of language, but it also hits on what machine translators use, MT use to produce translations, all of these rules, the different syntax and everything. But then the limitations of that, because we can take those rules and then just say, what, forget it. We're gonna do what we do as native speakers, and we make new words up, we make new constructions up. For example, a few years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, the word yeet came into the language off of a YouTube video where they threw like a soda can down the hall and said yeet. And then from that, I've seen iterations of it where the past tense of yeet is yoked. I yoked it. And that's just how language is, just an example of one word. But I mean, you're always going to be playing, catch up with machine translation, because it's not just, there's more complex things in that as well. So anyway, any questions or observations from what you saw? Hold on, where's everything? No, I don't want that. Wrong one. New share. Stop share. All right, I don't know why it's not showing. Let me pull up the PowerPoint again. I don't know why it's not showing the PowerPoint. Okay, I'm gonna have to share my screen. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Zoom is acting up. All right, so that's the application. That's kind of the first scientific approach to translation. They tried to take information theory and universal grammar, take a linguistic kind of statistical approach, and that's kind of been what's guided it since then. The linguistic approach is less based on Chomsky nowadays and more based on just a massive mining of text, as we read in the text you had to read for the end of last week, the week before break, which we'll talk about today. But the whole idea of statistics and probability is used a lot in machine translation. So we're going to kind of talk about for what we have left. We have about 13 minutes left in class. We're going to talk about what you had to read from the Handbook of Translation and Technology, the one that you can get on the library. Like I said, it limits me to the number of pages I can download, so I can't just send you the copy of the book, but you can, with your credentials, get into the Texas Tech Library and read it. But kind of, it was talking about parallel text and bilingual concordance, and that's what we've been talking about when it comes to machine translation. I've shown you a huge monolingual corpus that maybe possibly could be used in like the subtitle or something like that. But in order to create a translator, you need to have parallel text with that. So if it says, like in English, if it says something in English, for example, if it says like, I don't know, pediatrician, you're gonna have to have that lexical parallel in Spanish, pediatra or pediatra. If it says niet in Russian, you have to say no in Portuguese, or an iteration of that in another language, which is, it sounds easy, but then you have some languages where you don't actually have adverbs for negation. The negation is within the verb. So you have this, for example, you have it within in Arabic. I don't know Arabic, but you have it in Mapufungún. For example, you can say the word kimfin which is, uh, which is I know him or her. Where's the enye? Hold on. There you go, Kim Fiend. And if you say I don't know him or her, it's Kim, and then the negation particle la, and then splits this. So Kim la Fiend, I don't know him or her. So that negation is within it, and that's just a present tense negation. You can have, if you have like negation in a command would be, for example, fem finge. That'd be do it. So if you don't want to say don't do it, it'd be fem kill, sorry, finge. So that's the negation. That means no, but only in the sense of commands in Mapudungun. And then if you have, it's called subordinate, like subordinate clauses. So subordinate clause would be I know that I smell bad or something. So this, that I smell bad, that's a subordinate clause. It's connected to the main one, which is I know, and this, that connects it to it. So in Mapudungun, you could say, you know, so I don't forget, and it'd be a subordinate clause, tani, ngoi, ma, no, al. So that no right there is your negation in subordinate clauses. So even for something like negation, it's a little bit difficult. It's difficult to find parallel texts between different languages, depending on their structures, their typological distances. But we'll talk about it. Parallel text is just what it sounds like. It's basically, you know, you think of the Rosetta Stone, you have one text in the one language, and that same text, you know, and it's like an instruction manual. You had to put something together. You've got it in a lot of times English, French, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, and then you've, you know, maybe got some other like Korean, and you got some other languages that get thrown in there. But the main ones usually are like the trade languages, English and French, and then you have more common one, and then you have other ones like Spanish and Portuguese and stuff like that. So, so that's an example of what I mean by parallel text. While a lot of these give context, well, modern parallel text bilingual concordance are used in machine translation databases. We talked about that before spring break. You just have these massive lexical databases a lot of times, and the more modern ones use neural networks and at the sentence and phrase level. And so they can give context. A lot of the modern parallel text bilingual concordance things, they can give context, but you need to do stuff called alignment, basically. So what alignment is you can't just assume that everything's subject, verb, object. I ate the apple. You can't assume that every language is like that. Some languages would be the apple I ate. Some languages would be I ate. Some language ate I the apple. And so you need to align them and indicate to the algorithm, indicate the parameters within the statistical parameters, indicate what the equivalents are. And from our conversation on equivalence, we know that there are already problems right there with equivalence. What are the equivalents? Structural equivalents are a little bit less, I guess you say, abstract, but you could definitely get a structural, they align like structural equivalents, like subject, verb, object, adverbs, adjectives, negation, affirmation, stuff like that. And so this is why when I teach translation classes like this one or Spanish 4309, when I say don't overuse automatic translators, it's not just the, you know, academic, I guess you say integrity sort of part of it. It's also because we're going to go into, you know, the details of how they work. It not only impedes your ability as a translator, but they're just not perfect. You're not going to get, you're not going to get the correct answer every time. You're not going to get the correct output every time. And the more and more you use these things, you get experience with it. So I can tell when something, you know, more often than not, has been put through an automatic translator. Because they're just things that automatic translators tend to do. Remember, they're using probability a lot of times. What is the probability that this is the output? This is the correct candidate. And there's sometimes the awkward alignment of things, of structure between different languages. It has this kind of feel of an automatic translator. And so you tend to use them, and I use them as a tool, just to give, you know, context. If I need to know what context I use this word in. So they should, in my opinion, be used as tools for individual translators. Now you have bigger projects, you have bigger corporations and companies, that try to rely on it to translate all of their stuff, but they still have the human element. For example, Facebook, a lot of it is automatically translated using Facebook, or sometimes you'll see like, oh, this translation brought to you by Bing. I don't know if they still have, the Bing translations or whatever. But you still have a team of people going through and polishing things up. For a while on Facebook, they would, ask, for some languages, they'll ask for input from speakers of that language to help them to kind of develop their model, their algorithm for translating that language. And that's difficult on Facebook because people aren't always writing the way you would not normally write on Facebook. So you have, a lot of contractions, you have a lot of words, brought, spelled differently, for example. And so the human element is still there. Today, parallel texts exist in the form of what are called translation memories, a database or structured record of past translations. They have many pairs of corresponding text in a number of different languages, and these are called translation units. And these translation units, it goes through that whole thing of probability. Okay, which one is given the context, given the alignment, given the order of words, a lot of different factors. What is the most likely candidate? And sometimes you'll get something that just spits out a translation. Sometimes you get something like Lingua that'll give you different context that it's in. So it'll give you a translation, but say, okay, it's in different contexts. Maybe this is, these are the different candidates. But then because of the massive amount of database, you need something called a threshold, a similarity threshold, just so you don't get overwhelmed by every single piece of data that is in that database, every single translation memory. So translators, where they do have a similarity threshold, tend to set it at about 70 to 90% similarity. Come on, let's go. So, from your text, it says, given a new text to be translated, the system first uses translation units, typically sentences. It then looks up each unit in its database, searching for the exact approximate or fuzzy matches. When the translation units are found in the translation memory whose source language versions match the units from the new text, the system proposes their target language versions for reuse to the translator, who is then free to keep, modify, or discard them as he or she sees fit. So you see already a difference in how we process language and how these machine translators are processing language. We don't sit there and thinking, okay, what's the best candidate? It kind of just, we process it differently and more organically. And so this is, once again, one of those limitations of machine translation. It can't, there is no sentience behind these machine translations. It's all an algorithm, probability and statistics and parameters that are set up and continually being modified, but by humans. And they continually have to be modified and polished up if they want to keep up. So this is used, machine translation is used as a tool for the overwhelming majority of translators. A lot of times getting context, maybe sayings, different things, but not something to translate an entire text and do your entire work by, for the majority of translators. Now, as you get on larger scales, like I said, companies like Google and Facebook and stuff like that, Amazon, they will rely on it a little bit more, but still have that human element. And they're usually better for more experienced translators who can review things like the continuity of syntax and terminology. So you can pick out those red flags and switch it around and make it, better. You can pick out errors that can be egregious or maybe minute, and that might not be able to be picked up by maybe a more of a beginning translator. But if you don't know how to do it, or you do it poorly, the resulting translations can be riddled with issues. And I've seen this in some of the translation classes I've taught. I see it in everyday translations where someone thinks they can just pull a lever and, there's the translation. When that job I was working at, like I told you guys, there was one time where somehow it had a term that had the term puff, and like a puff of smoke, or poof or something like that. Poof, it like disappeared. And that's what it was going at. But it is a negative term in, British English. And for some reason, the algorithm picked that terminology and translated it into that negative, very offensive term and spit it out in the subtitles. And if there had been no manual element, we would have caught it. We caught it after the fact, but we still caught it. Still, you wonder like who saw that, and that's potentially obviously legal issues and all that. And so it's a tool. Like I said, you can't at this point in time rely on it to be as good as humans, no matter how complex its neural network is. So parallel text, you have, several approaches. IBM developed a statistical approach, translation probabilities. So basically you have a probability table, target language, I don't know, is it language, word in T, and then you have, the possibilities based on context on one side, and it gives you, using statistical methods, the most likely candidate in that case, which sometimes is correct, and sometimes you need like that human element to basically correct it or to make those changes. It's a phrase-based approach as opposed to lexically or terminologically based. So it gives you more context, gives you more linguistic, gives you more of a larger panoramic picture, I guess you could say, of the language as opposed to just word, 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 word. So it gives more context than these first kind of lexically based ones. And then neural networks, we'll talk about this next class, but the latest form of parallel text mining or collecting, and it's used on Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Alibaba, which is China's version of Amazon, eBay, and Cistern. So we'll watch a couple of these videos next week next class when we talk about neural networks. But are there any questions up to this point? So the basic, we're not going to learn, we're not learning computer engineering here. That's a whole class, different class. You got to, several classes to learn how to basically make your own neural network, make your own, use your own database, because there's open source stuff that people mine for their machine translation and all that. But it's kind of showing you the inner workings of it. So it's not, a lot of times when people look at translation, whether it's human or machine, they just see it as a lever that you pull and a source text goes in and a target text comes out, and they don't know what's going on in the in-between that influences what comes out, and that which is, influences the quality of the product. It can have repercussions if it's like we see, we will bury you as opposed to we will be there when you're buried, sort of thing. And so that's what the point of this is not so you learn, you go into the statistical computer language side of it. It's just so you know what's kind of going on, at least superficially, on, between, typing it into one side of Google Translate and clicking translate. What is going on in there? What is everything that's going on, and how that can influence the quality of your translations and translations in general. And